kind of make it so there's a narrow choke for your enemy to funnel their units through. But Zerg players shouldn't necessarily down this map, because with all the counterattack possibilities and the fact that if you do have a Terran or Protoss partner, you're going to be able to expand and be aggressive on this map. Protoss players, there's probably some better maps you could keep up, because these back rocks, unless if you make a full wall back there, it's going to be difficult to defend them. So even if you end up making like a second pylon here to put the rest of your production buildings, you might forget completely about your back rocks. So that's one thing you have to kind of be aware of on this map. And Terran also has the advantage of being able to make a wall here, but not completely denying themselves the ability to take this expansion later into the game. So that's one thing that favors Terran for sure on this map. Besides that, there's not really too much else to talk about. Generally, more direct pushes are the better strategy on this map, because teams that can control these Xel'Naga towers aren't really going to be able to suffer too much against drops, because most of the area has kind of land space before you get into the actual main base here. So even Marines or Blink Stalkers are going to be able to defend pretty effectively on this map. But you do have to watch out for high ground warp-ins, because it's pretty common for opponents to do high ground warp-ins with an Overlord here, or even somewhere down here. Alright, well, we'll be on to the next map here, which is Tyrador Keep. This is the next map, Tyrador Keep. This map features a in-base expansion, which is similar to another map that we'll get into in a little bit, the Boneyard. In this case, the expansion is right next to some destructible rocks. So this is going to make the expansion not quite as safe, and also the fact that it's not tucked in behind both of your main bases also makes it a little bit more vulnerable, because this area along here, as long as the opponent has vision of the high ground, they're going to be able to harass your mineral line. So the expansion is safe from initial rushes, but as soon as higher tech units are into the game, you're not going to have a safe expansion necessarily against a timing push. These destructible rocks are kind of a blessing and also a hindrance in a way. If you're trying to get out on the map and defend against a push where an opponent went Colossus or tanks and they're harassing your mineral line, it's difficult to try and break down these rocks, because they'll be able to hit you from the other side. But at the same time, if you're going against a 4-pull or a bio push, or going against Lings early, this is going to keep your expansion safe and buy you all the time you need to defend it. This map is usually better to have a Terran player on it, because with tanks you can pretty much defend any point in this map. So if you have tanks, you can actually defend this expansion out here, because tanks will easily be able to hit all the way to the far edge of this area right here. Also, tanks are going to be able to defend against harassment into your mineral line if you take this in-base expansion. Most common strategies that you're going to find are both teams will generally be taking an expansion on this map, regardless of what races you are. So you're going to find that if you have one player who takes an expansion and the other team takes 2 expansions, they're going to be vulnerable to a timing attack, especially if the team that initially took the only one expansion does some kind of all-in off of that. It's generally greedy if your opponents are, if you can't determine if your opponents are taking the in-base expansion or not, to try and take both expansions, because if you're just assuming that your opponents took the in-base expansion, you might find yourself being ahead 2 bases initially, but not having nearly enough army supply to actually defend the outside expansion. High ground warp-ins are also kind of a bit of an issue on this map, because there's so many places you can hide an Overlord, and there's really a long ridge along the entirety of the base where you're going to be able to set up a pylon out of reach of the enemy players, or maybe out of sight, and then they're going to be able to warp in. Also, this is what is going to make drops and blink-ins very annoying to deal with on this map. I've lost a lot of games where an opponent went just blink observer, and we got our expansion up and they didn't have one, but they would just continuously blink into my base back here with an Overlord or an observer, take out a bunch of workers or a production building or something like that, and eventually they would be able to whittle us down, regain an even footing in economy, and eventually overtake us. As you get later into the game, you're going to find that control of the Xel'Naga towers is really critical to both defending and offense on this map. If you can deny your opponent's vision, you're going to be able to do very effective attacks, But all the same, if you are able to control these towers at all, or at least see pushes coming, they're usually easy to defend. Because of this, how these destructible rocks work, if you don't see pushes coming and your opponent sets up and has siege tanks out here, or they get in position beforehand, it's going to be difficult to defend your base with these destructible rocks. Eventually, if you do end up having all of these bases run dry, both the natural for this player here and the in-base expansion starts running dry, there is a gold expansion that's fairly easy to defend once you take down these destructible rocks, but besides that, all the other expansions are very far across the map. So the only time you're really going to be able to take them is if you're able to hide one and your opponents don't realize it initially, but generally if you do have an expansion all the way out here on the opposite side of the map, then the game's more or less over at that point, because you usually have so much map control that eventually your opponents are going to run dry first. Okay, well that'll cover it for this map here. We'll get into the next one, which is Magma Core, and that is personally one of my favorite maps in the entire 2v2 map pool. This is our next to last map here. This is Magma Core. Now the reason I love this map is because it's open to any kind of strategy on this map. You can be extremely aggressive on this map, and that's very viable. You can be really defensive initially, and that's also very strong strategy on this map. There's almost no strategy that you can't execute on this map, because even though there is one ramp that has a shared base for both players, the rush distance is fairly short, so you can still be aggressive. There's also expansions all over the place. Most of them are fairly difficult to defend, excluding the expand right down at the base of the ramp. This is the only one that's really easy to defend. And also, the Xel'Naga towers also give you vision of basically the most important part of the map, which is the center, because you're going to have counterattacks constantly going around the outside of the map, but controlling the center is really going to be critical, because that's going to be the shortest distance between you and your opponents. Timing attacks are very strong on this map, because if you're able to block this ramp off completely and do, say, a 7 to 9 minute push into the game, even if your opponent expands, because of the short distance between bases, you're not going to have to worry too much about counterattacks, and you're also going to be able to crush your opponent's army if they don't prepare the instant that you move out. In general, though, I would say that this map kind of favors Zerg a little bit, because if, for instance, you spawn up here and your opponent spawn cross map, it's actually just about as safe to take this gold expansion down here as it is to take this expansion right here, because the distance between the bases isn't really that much further. As far as strategies go later in the game on this map, you're going to notice that there is a lot of space kind of around the edge of your base that is really inaccessible by land. So this is going to make drops, warp prism harass, mutalisk, and all sorts of other tech strategies very annoying later in the game. For the same reason, once you take this initial expansion here, your partner's kind of left on his own to try and take and expand. It's not very easy to defend. So usually at that point you need to have a little map control or apply enough pressure to your opponent so you can take these expansions up here. If you do have siege tanks, usually you can defend the outside expansions pretty easily, because this ramp and this ramp will be critical to defending your expansions. However, drops and warp-ins and blink stalkers are still going to be very annoying to deal with. Well, that'll pretty much cover it for this map then. And the last map we're going to get into is the Boneyard, which is a very small map, kind of depending where your opponents spawn on that map. Welcome to the last map, the Boneyard. This map is a bit Terran favored, only because, once again, just like High Orbit and Discord 4, you have a gold expansion with a Xel'Naga tower. So once you do move out of your ramp, there's not a whole lot of distance between there and your expansion, which makes it pretty easy to defend already. And if your opponent's bases are sitting here, you can almost do an offensive planetary rush, where you take this base as a planetary fortress, and with siege tanks, you're able to basically leapfrog within within walking distance of your opponent's ramp, and completely just demolish their production line at the front of their base. And that's really going to create contain so that your opponents can't take expansions outside this pocket expansion very easily. Speaking of the pocket expansion, this is also something that's very easy to defend. So teams with a Zerg are really going to like this map because the pocket expansion means that they can safely expand against any race combination, even against another double Zerg team, assuming that your partner either goes for a forge early, or else completely blocks off, or if you have a Terran partner, he can get like 2 barracks and 2 depots up here and block this ramp off. But if you do spawn close to your opponents, you are going to have to deal with drops because the distance between bases is very short. So drop ships and Hellion drops are going to be very common on this map. Even Banshees are also very annoying to deal with because the distance between bases isn't very far, and until you get any kind of detection up, or like a turret or a spore crawler, it's difficult to defend your workers effectively because the Banshees usually aren't going to die since they're just so close to the ledge here, and the mineral line is also very close to the ledge, which means that Stalkers and Marines and everything else really aren't going to be able to hit them effectively. The Xel'Naga towers are going to be pretty critical for maintaining map control. This is what's going to basically tell you when your opponent's out on the map. It's also going to make it easier to defend your ramp and know when timing attacks are coming. Zerg players are usually going to like this map just because between the pocket expansion back here and the gold and this other blue expansion here, they're all pretty easy to defend, and there's a lot of wide open space in the center of the map. So this makes it very easy for Zerg to kind of maneuver their units around, and it makes counterattacks also quite easy. The only time that Zerg's not going to like this is if they have a Terran on either side of them. But if, for instance, you could spawn cross map in your Zerg, this is almost the perfect map for Zerg in 2v2. Mainly because of the in-base expansion. As a Protoss player, you're going to find that Colossus are pretty good, Warp Prism Harass is very good, Blink Stalkers aren't that good on this map because there's not really much space for your opponent to try and blink in your base without getting trapped inside. Because the front really only extends as long as this portion right here, which is basically from one end of your ramp to the other. Besides that, there's really no way to get into your enemy's base with Blink Stalkers and not get trapped in there and just lose all of your units. What you're going to have trouble doing is taking expansions later in the game once you have to get out to these expands out here. Because once you get to that point, it becomes really difficult to defend because drops and proxy pylons over there across the map, or Ling run-bys or mutas are going to be able to take out expansions that don't have near enough defense. If you're a Terran and Protoss team and you're going against someone who does an early expansion on this map, you can usually do like a 4-gate or a mass bio push or a tank push, and they're very potent on this map because once you can get a contain on the ramp, it's very hard for your opponent to move out past that point. So even if one team expands on this map, it's really not game over, because if you can maintain map control and keep your opponent contained in their base, you're going to be able to take all the expansions on the map, assuming you don't get too greedy with that. Alright, well, I hope this guys helps you out when you're trying to pick maps in the 2v2 map pool, and I'll have more videos for you guys coming up very soon.